We're here for another installment of Democracy Ideas at the International Forum for Democratic Studies, and we're delighted to have with us Francis Fukuyama to discuss his new article, Democracy and the Quality of the State, that appears in the Journal of Democracy. Francis Fukuyama, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
You asked the question why it is that some countries have been able to develop high-quality state administrations that deliver services to their populations, while others have been plagued with corruption, overweening bureaucracies, and incompetence. What factors do you see as the most critical for explaining the differences between more and less successful countries in this regard?
Well, I think there's historically been two routes to having a modern state. And by a modern state, I mean a state where you're selected as a public official on the basis of merit, you're promoted on the basis of your expertise. It requires education and background, and rather than just being politically connected to whoever happens to be in power. And I think, unfortunately, one of the big historical routes to getting to that kind of state has been military competition, because there's something about the existential threat posed by an invading army that focuses the mind and makes you get rid of your incompetent cousin who's the general and replace that person with somebody that actually knows military strategy. And in fact, this happened during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln's first generals were all political patronage appointees, and they lost battles, and it took a while to get to Ulysses Grant as his commander. So that's what happened in the case of Prussia. That's what happened in the case of Japan. There are a number of countries that develop strong bureaucracies on the basis of that kind of national security imperative. Fortunately, that's not the only route, because I think that other countries develop in societies that develop an interest in having a good, clean, uncorrupt state. Most businesses would rather have a neutral rule of law rather than have to pay bribes or have to have political connections in order to make any money. And what happened in the case of both Britain and the United States was the emergence of what I call a middle-class coalition. So essentially, the old bureaucracy was a patronage bureaucracy. In the United States, this was known as the patronage system. But as the country industrialized, you get these new groups that don't have a stake in the old system, that want clean government, and then they start organizing and lobbying and pushing, for agitating and pushing for civil service reform. And that's really what happened in the 1880s at the start of the progressive era in the United States.
In your article, you examine the experience of Greece and Italy and their struggle to achieve better governance. What role has clientelism played in their struggle to do this?
A clientelistic system is one in which you basically give your political supporters individualized benefits in return for their political support. And so in the American system, this usually consisted in the 19th century of jobs. Job in the post office, job on the police force, job in the customs house. And that's how politicians got people to the polls and mobilized supporters and got elected to office. And so I argue actually that clientelism, this form of clientelism, is basically an early form of democracy, because at a certain level of low income and low education, it's much easier to get people interested in supporting you for that kind of a personal benefit, rather than because you care about foreign policy or you want the government to do a certain thing vis-a-vis, its neighbors or something of that sort. And that's, I think, bad for the quality of public bureaucracies, because you want people selected on the basis of merit and expertise, and not simply because they happen to vote for a particular politician.
Why is it that the performance of state bureaucracies are so important to the health of democracies around the world?
For many people, democracy is not actually an end in itself. It is a value that we all share, but it's also a means to having effective government, meaning people want education, security, public health, good roads, infrastructure, a lot of public goods that governments are supposed to provide. And I think many democracies have undermined their own legitimacy through their failure to provide these basic things. And conversely, if you think about a country like China or Singapore, to authoritarian countries. One of the reasons that they're widely admired in many parts of the world is that they can provide electricity, water, health, economic growth, despite the fact that they're not democracies. And that, I think has damaged the prestige of a number of democracies, their failure to provide these kinds of state services.
And recently there have been suggestions by some observers that countries such as Egypt pursue something called responsible governance, even if the definition of that term isn't quite clear. Do you think it's possible for countries to achieve responsible governance in the absence of democratic accountability?
There's a very complicated relationship between good quality government and responsiveness. Of course, governments have to be responsive to the broad wishes of the public. They have to be accountable in that sense. But sometimes governments can be responsive in the absence of actual formal democratic procedures. And so Singapore is, a case of this, that they provide basically things that their citizens want, even though there's very limited party competition and so forth. And by contrast, there are other democracies like India, which, although they have regular free and fair elections, have a lot of trouble delivering infrastructure and health and economic growth. And so there's this, this is why I think there's a need for democratic accountability, but there's also a need to, have public services that really function efficiently, and sometimes, the one gets in the way of the other. Now, in the case of the Middle East, I think you've got a big problem because these are not like the Chinese or Singaporean governments. I mean, whatever you've got in Egypt, it's not going to be that kind of government. It's going to be a military, dictatorship. The performance of that dictatorship in the past under Mubarak was not good. It just led to a kind of crony capitalism and economic stagnation. And so I'm not terribly optimistic that they're going to achieve a form of developmental authoritarianism.
Francis Fukuyama, thank you very much for talking with us.
Okay, thank you.